Hello, everyone. I am Benoit Rioux. I'm the chair of MethodsNet. I'm delighted to welcome you today for this MethodsNet Community webinar series event on the topic of research methods textbooks and their use for pedagogy and student supervision at different levels, which is organized by my friend and colleague Christine. So welcome to you all. And let me just first tell you a few words about MethodsNet, and I will not be long. Um, yeah, so what is MethodsNet? We are a quite young organization. We were launched 4 years ago. And we are a global association, membership-based association, operating on a non-for-profit basis. And what we are doing is supporting research methods, development, pedagogy, innovation, robust use across multiple disciplines, across social sciences, very broadly defined. And what we do in very concrete terms, we organize two major events. I'll tell you a bit more about it shortly thereafter. Then we also offer membership. We offer a global expert network and some communities, including a community about pedagogy and training and teaching. And we also develop services such as an expert database, which will be online soon, and also some other tools that we are sharing with the fellow colleagues also via the communities. Yep, so you may join us anytime. We are a very open, very pluralistic organization. So please, next slide. Yep, and so talking about the two flagship events, we're organizing a mostly in-person event every year, which is a summer school, which is organized in Vienna together with the Central European University, a great research place in a great city. And the first week is online with a number of online courses, and then most of the courses are in person, covering the whole span of research methodologies from interpretive to computational and everything in between, and the whole cycle of data production, data analysis, always with a reflective perspective and with a one-to-one pedagogy, small group teaching for PhD level teaching excellence. And so you can still register until the 20th of April. So now is the time if you haven't registered yet. And we also have our conference. Our third conference will take place in Belgium, Louvain-la-Neuve, close to Brussels, in person plus also remote, late October, as you can see on the slide. And we have a broad set of formats from the classical panels and panel papers, but also other types of interactive sessions and training sessions in different formats, as well as plenary events and very lively session types. You can join us from anywhere in the world, and hopefully also close to Brussels this next autumn. And the call is also on until the month of May. Check it out on our website. And I will not say much more. I will now shortly give the floor to my friend and colleague, Christine Gibb, from the Executive Board of MethodsNet. And so the floor is yours, Christine.
Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Chris Gibb, and I'm a prof at the University of Ottawa. And as Benoit mentioned, I'm also one of the co-conveners of the Research Methods Teaching Community of Practice. And I'm very happy to be your moderator for today's webinar. So as all of today's speakers are professors who work at the University of Ottawa in Canada, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the Algonquin Nation on whose territory our university sits, and where we do a lot of our work as researchers, as teachers, as supervisors, and in the case of the panelists as textbook authors. So, the University of Ottawa's Indigenous affirmation is meant to promote a spirit of awareness of the relationships between Indigenous peoples in Canada and the University of Ottawa. So, here it is. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous peoples in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. A core part of our ecosystem here at MethodsNet is our communities. So these are digital spaces where you can take part in debates, you can share resources, and network with your peers. Today's session is hosted by the Research Methods Teaching Community of Practice, which provides a collaborative space for asking and addressing practical teaching related questions and for reflecting on how research methods are taught and learned. By joining this community, you'll gain access to expert database, to the specialized discussion hubs, and a space to crowdsource ideas and solutions to your pedagogical and methodological hurdles. So as Benoit mentioned, we invite you to join us as a member, whether you are a student, and I see a couple of students on the call, whether you're early career, whether you're a senior expert. So for the rest of the session today, I'm mostly going to be turning it over to our four speakers. So I'm thrilled to host our four speakers who have recently, in the past 4 or 5 years, authored research methods textbooks. So I'll briefly introduce them and their textbooks, and in the chat we'll post links to their textbooks. So our speakers for today are Dr. Christina Clark-Kazak, who's a professor at the School of Public and International Affairs, and who is the author of Research Across Borders, An Introduction to Interdisciplinary Cross-Cultural Methodology, and that was published in 2023. Our second panelist is Dr. Daniel Stockamer, who's a professor in the School of Political Studies and author of Research Quantitative Methods for Social Sciences, a Practical Introduction with Examples in R, co-authored with Bordelot and published in 2023. And we actually have two of the editors from Research Methods in Critical Security, second edition. The first speaker is Dr. Mark Salter, who's a professor in the School of Political Studies, and he's joined by Dr. Phil Froud, an associate professor at the School of Political Studies as well. There is a fifth speaker up on the slide. Dr. Stéphanie Gaudet, professor at the School of Sociological and Anthropological Studies. She was unable to join us today, but she's very happy to connect with anyone who wants to learn more about her co-authored book, A Journey Through Qualitative Research from Design to Reporting. In today's panel discussion, Using Research Methods Textbooks in the Classroom and Student Supervision, a conversation with authors. The authors will do three broad topics. One is they'll present their textbooks, then they'll reflect on how they can be and have been used for teaching students in their research methods courses, as well as supervising student research projects. And the third is to share insights into the future of teaching research methods. The format for today is a moderated conversation in 3 parts, and we'll end with a 15 to 20-minute question and answer period. So if you have questions, please write them into the question box that you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our authors and panelists to introduce themselves and their textbooks. I'll just put these are their textbooks. So in this introduction, I'll invite you to just speak a bit about who are you. If you can give us the elevator pitch for your textbook, tell us a little bit about why you wrote the book and why it was important for you to write or to edit a research methods textbook. And each speaker has about 4 to 5 minutes, and then I will pop in and ask you to finish up. So the first person I see on my screen is Dr. Christina Clark-Kazik. So I'll turn it over to you to start us off.
Thank you so much, Christine, and thank you so much to MethodsNet for hosting this session. So my book is called Research Across Borders, An Introduction to Interdisciplinary Cross-Cultural Methodology. So I'm an accidental academic. I worked for 8 years as a public servant and a diplomat before I became an academic. And in fact, I never intended to do this as a full-time job. So I feel very privileged to be here. But all of my degrees are interdisciplinary, from my undergraduate all the way to my PhD. And I've also been teaching since 2007 research methods courses in 4 different interdisciplinary, internationally focused programs at both undergraduate and graduate level, and in both French and English. And what I found through that experience, both as a student but also as a professor, is there's not really a textbook that is explicitly international and explicitly interdisciplinary. So this book is really for those programs like migration studies, development studies, conflict studies, human rights. And I wanted to make the book epistemologically plural. So in other words, it's not coming from one particular epistemological paradigm. In the introduction, I talk about borders of knowledge between disciplines, but also borders between different epistemological approaches. And I introduce readers to different epistemological approaches, including indigenous ways of knowing. So trying to open up, thinking about what do we consider to be knowledge and how we think about knowledge. And so this book is really intended for students and scholars and researchers who are thinking across borders, both disciplinarily, epistemologically, but also in terms of the research subjects themselves.
Thank you very much, and thank you for keeping in time. All right, the next panelist I have up on my screen is Daniel. So I know you have some slides, so I'm going to stop sharing mine, and you should be able to share.
Perfect. I went back. So okay. So my textbook is kind of from basically from the need of my teaching to not have anything appropriate. I mean, I have been teaching quantitative methods since a graduate student and have never used the textbook because I found them either too mathematical. I found them, they were dissolved from the research process. They were not, or they lacked practical applications, or these data sets they used, they were already dated like 10 years ago. Nobody was interested in. And student didn't get like a holistic picture of the research process. I mean, for me, the research process starts with, okay, here we start with a hypothesis or with a research question. Then based on this, we then select or collect data that allows us to answer the research question. And then we move on the analytical part. But basically what most textbooks did, they just focus on the analytical part. But it's very tough for students to capture if they don't have the data generating process before, and also the thought process that went along conceiving the research. So this made me kind of, I felt the need to do something. And then this was kind of facilitated because I had some discussions at conferences with editors, and they say, hey, you're absolutely right. We need this textbook. Why don't you just use your slides you use for your classes and turn them into a textbook? And so the idea of this is it's a little bit of an introduction in survey research and quantitative methods. And the idea is that the book has kind of three parts. First, we need to know how to do a survey. And then students will actually do a survey in group, will solicit answers, and then they will use their own data to analyze the survey. And this is kind of a holistic approach. And this shows them a little bit, okay, here's what researchers actually do, and here's why it's relevant. And for me, this is also a way to get students attentive, because quantitative method, a lot of students, especially in the social sciences, especially a department like ours, that's more like critical, and it's not necessarily a focus on methods. It's very important to kind of take them by the hand and say, hey, this is neat, this is helpful what you're doing. This is what you need when you work in the government or elsewhere. So this is, let's say, my starting pitch. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share the slide again so you can see the cover of the textbook. Okay, so I'll now invite Dr. Phil Froud to introduce yourself and the textbook and why you wrote it.
Okay. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I am based, like my co-editor Mark, at the School of Political Studies at the University of Ottawa, and we both work within this kind of growing field of critical security studies, which is a growing and increasingly global one. And I think when we work together on both. I was an author in the first edition, which was published in 2013, and a co-editor in the second edition, published 10 years after that. So in terms of the first edition, and I think Mark will add to this as well. I mean, like the first edition was written in terms of trying to make sense of what was still at that time a kind of insurgent field in some ways, right? And I think that when we looked at the community of critical security studies scholars in its different locations, North America and Europe and beyond, a lot of scholars are in departments where their work might not be recognized, are trying to present and publish in places where there were limited venues or where they, had to make stronger claims about research design and might not have had those tools available for them off the shelf. And so I think this was part of the pitch for the book, which is that you can have the best of both in a way. You can have a kind of non-rationalist qualitative work in critical security studies with this added rigor of clear and enunciated research design and sort of leaving traces of that work. And I think there's part of the work of this book is also helping scholars in the field to create not necessarily reproducible methods, but to highlight their particular approaches and their trajectories, which are then again helpful for others. So I came into the second edition as a co-editor, partly out of enthusiasm for us to reflect as well the kind of contributions within the field in the 10 years since the first edition, and also to reflect the state of the field as we saw it, right? So there's still the sort of duty to coherence of the first edition and this kind of overall thrust in terms of making research design accessible and interesting to our field, but also through the many smaller chapters where people highlight their individual experiences of research design, reflecting the field as it had grown in that time.
Thank you very much, Phil. And now Dr. Mark Salter.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for the invitation to have this conversation. I think that part of our elevator pitch and intervention in the field was, as Phil said, to make an accessible teaching text that was plural. I think that what I observed in other teaching texts from our corner of the discipline of international relations was that it was very much kind of that Archimedean God point of view. This is what discourse analysis, there's one way to do it. And that did not reflect my experience either as a researcher or as a professor. And so what we wanted to do was we asked for people to make very short interventions that were kind of theory light. So, it was 5,000 words. It was not meant to go into whether they were an early Foucauldian or late Foucauldian, but to describe in very practical steps what tool they used, why they used it, and what the result of that was. And so whether or not the tool was useful. And so, as Phil said, we did some grouping with different methodological groups, but each chapter really tried to represent how a professor, how a scholar had gone through a specific research project and sort of like what the value and what the limitations of a particular method was. And I think that that comes from my own sense, that methods are a toolbox and that some tools are better for particular jobs than others. And I also wanted to kind of embody how messy I think research is and how contingent it is, and that whatever methodological plan you have, it collapses with the first engagement with the field. And so we wanted to show some of that messiness, show some of that real lived experience. And I will say, just to be super explicit, part of the reason why I wrote this book was I was coming up for promotion to full, and I wanted to demonstrate that I was impacting the field. And so, I had this disciplinary vision of how to intervene, but I also had a really very clear institutional evaluation for which I thought this would be a legible product. Just to be super explicit. Thanks.
This is part of the reason why I'm inviting the authors to come and speak, because these are some of the things that aren't necessarily in the about the authors part of the book. So we'll move on to the second question. And again, if you have particular questions, you can pop them into the chat and we will return to them at the question and answer period at the end. So we're going to get into some of the nitty gritty of actually using the textbooks. And for our panelists, you can answer these questions in whichever way feels most appropriate for you. So the broad topics for you to consider in this part of our conversation are: how did you intend for your textbook to be used and by whom? So you're all university professors, so presumably there's a university bent to it, but perhaps there are other people who you were hoping to use the textbook. Since the book's publication, how have you or how have other people used the textbook, and who has used it? So perhaps there's a mismatch between your original design and who's actually used it. What kind of feedback have you received from students about your book? Tell us a bit about the features in your book that make it user-friendly for actually teaching research methods. And lastly, if you could touch on some of your recommendations. So how would you recommend that professors use the book in a research methods course, either for undergraduate or for graduate students? How would you recommend that professors use your book when they're supervising either undergraduate students in their research projects or grad students? And lastly, how would you recommend that professors or researchers use your book when they're doing collaborative research with non-academic partners? So these non-academic partners may be involved in designing the research, in conducting the research, in doing the analysis, or sharing the results. So broad question, how are your textbooks being used? And we'll do this round in reverse order. So, Mark, I'll invite you to start us off.
Thank you. So our vision was, again, theory light and sort of, like jargon free. And so we asked the authors to make it user friendly from the get go. That was the kind of that was the mission. We see that it's being used by a lot of fourth year seminars, capstone seminars, and intro courses, depending on where you are. Like if you're in an international relations department, you might use it earlier on in the methods. If you're in a political science department, you might use it in a capstone. We asked the authors to include a bibliography at the end of 4 or 5 important works. So we asked them to minimize the footnotes to make it more narrative, but then include a bibliography of important works in that field or important works to that research project. And I think that for a number of the narratives, a number of the chapters are really amazingly honest about the research project and how it went. And so like there's one by our friend and colleague Luis Lobo Guerrero where he says, I wanted to do archive on British naval insurance. So I went to Lloyd's of London and that archive had burnt down. And so I went to the Admiralty and that archive had been moved to another place and then it flooded. And then I went here and then that one had also burnt down. And so, he kind of described the way in which he kind of navigated to find the archive. And I find that students find that super validating and reassuring that, like particularly when they're in the beginning phases. I will just point out, I'm sure Phil will have different things to say. One of the ways that I've used this textbook is that I've asked students to come with their central research project, but then every week in class when we discuss another method or another methodological tool, to rewrite a research proposal as if they were going to use that tool. So if they're researching borders, then like one week they'll look at it. How would I do border studies using discourse analysis? Next week it's ethnography. How would I do border studies using ethnography? Next week it's affect. And I have found whenever I've done that really kind of gives students a really great practical, pragmatic sense that if I ask these questions and use this tool, I get this kind of answers. But if I ask a similar question with different tools, then I get a radically different answer. And I can, and I find that that's been super helpful. I'll let Phil answer the tougher questions. Thank you.
All right, Phil, are you ready to answer these tougher sets of questions?
I'll give them a go. But yeah, just echoing what Mark had said, right, about this toolbox approach to methods. I think this was something that we were particularly keen on in terms of not necessarily just encouraging theoretical bricolage for its own sake, but really encouraging students to think through what is the best tool that I can use for this particular project or question that I have, and not necessarily starting from kind of classic hypotheses, but starting from the ways that a lot of our contributors do, which is a kind of puzzle or an unexpected kind of inquiry. Sometimes some of the questions, as you see in some of the chapters, they arise some way down the research process that of heart changes of mind, circumstances get in the way. And so I think there is this kind of serendipitous element to research methods that we try and capture in the book, and that is reflected in the reality of teaching methods, but also teaching students that one supervises about methods and how to use them and how to plan for this kind of life cycle of a project. So we definitely wanted this to be used at a range of levels. And I think even in undergraduate methods teaching, a lot of the kind of very personal touches in the chapters are very accessible and engaging, and they're short chapters. So there's this kind of grab and go format that instructors can use as a way of illustrating particular methods, which are often very sort of theoretical and abstract in the way that they're taught, but also can be the basis of assignments, right? Like Mark said, right? Like getting students to rethink a particular topic in light of a different method, or writing assignments that are kind of copycat approaches, right? Which is like writing these kind of reflective or personal experiences as part of the method's learning process. The thing I want to conclude with is this question of what we tried to achieve in positioning the book the way that we did was also ensuring that students and learners more generally and budding academics feel seen in a certain way, right? That the book is a enabler or a kind of permission structure for certain types of work that, sometimes you need a citation for a particular approach or a particular choice that you make theoretically, methodologically, that you need to justify. And it's been the case that this book is often the citation that students use for certain projects to justify and make space for work that might not have had space before.
Can you give us an example? Because I think that's a really good one. I know we have a couple of aspiring instructors on the call right now. So if you can share one example.
I'm trying to think of something. I mean, like, I see this in the sort of Google Scholar notifications of how the book gets cited. And sometimes you see this in all sorts of academic publications, but also sometimes, you get PDFs of people's like master's theses, for example, where you see the book and particular chapters that are cited in those academic works in a range of places. You'll see stuff from India, from Turkey, from all sorts of places. And so that's one sort of concrete example, but I often notice and sort of take note of areas where, for example, our section on like corporeal methods and affect gets cited in certain ways for work that is really, I would say, is sort of at the cutting edge of not necessarily the field of IR, but you see this elsewhere, even in like surveillance studies in sociology. You see some of the ways that people try to bring in some of those methods and arguments into sort of cognate fields.
Okay. So we're seeing a lot of going beyond the initial discipline of where your textbook is situated. That's really interesting. Thank you. Daniel, I will turn
I think
it over
I'll just
to
talk. I don't need the slides anymore. So
Okay.
I mean, that's maybe where it's a good connection point. Even if Philip's and Mark's book is completely different than mine, but what I was super surprised is this is actually used all over the world. I mean, and not only in political science, but in engineering studies, something I've never thought about. So, and also, I mean, this is the book that's basically a little bit my signature work. I mean, it has nearly 1.5 million downloads and over 1,000 citations. And this is something I would have never, ever imagined when starting this book. I mean, never, ever. You don't write a textbook to get citations by definition. But again, this is really read as a self-serving tool. So people use it to teach themselves. And it's also, I mean, I know of a lot of instructors from different places and even from different disciplines. They use it. And it brings me to the point of why is this the case? Because I think it's one of the few textbooks that really starts from the perspective of a researcher. The idea is you replicate the research process. In my case, the survey and quantitative research process through the different steps. So first, people or users need to get an introduction of the general research process. So how does it work? What's the hypothesis? What's the research question? Very simple. And then in a second, survey research is probably the most used quantitative technique we still employ. And so very simple question. How do you do a survey? How do you do questions? What's to avoid? What are different types of questions? How do you structure a survey? How long should it be? So these very simple questions are brought down in a very simple way. And then in the next stage, of course, this will be a convenient sample. People need to actually, or the students in the class, in groups, or in the textbook need to actually go about and say, hey, let's do this survey. And then they analyze their own survey, which gives them also some ownership. And they're excited. They want to know what they find. They want to know. And these surveys don't necessarily have to do something with political science. They can pick a topic they like on society. For example, some people choose how much do undergraduate students drink. Others, I mean, what are their favorite free time activities? So very, very open questions, but they have a connection to it. So I think what's important is students have an emotional connection. And then what I do, I really show, I mean, that the textbook has before been published with examples in SPSS and Stata, and then the second version in R to complement. And then I show really very easy, without a lot of math, okay, here's the survey, here are the different steps to do like some graphs to display the data. And here you go about to do some descriptive statistics or some bivariate statistics. And then we move on and end with a regression analysis. So this captures the same element or the same elements as a regular quantitative class, but really from a practical research perspective. And it can be, I mean, I also provide data, so they can just use the data I provide and replicate their study with what I do, because it's based on the survey some of my students did. So it's also very authentic. And I think, and again, one of the few textbooks that's really not focused on the mathematical reasoning behind it, but really the logical reasoning. I think I'm stopping here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And turning to Dr. Clark-Hazek, will you share about how you intended your textbook to be used and the different features and how you have learned people are using it?
So I wrote this textbook primarily as an undergraduate textbook, an introduction to methodology. And again, this was based on my experience of teaching not just methods, but also other sort of 101 courses of people. This is their first experience often with university as well as with research methods. And often when people come to the methodology course, first of all, it's a required course. And second of all, the title doesn't scream like this is going to be a great, interesting course. So you kind of have this upward a climb to try to get people interested in research. So I took that as a challenge and an opportunity, because I think as instructors, especially for students who are, coming to university for the first time, we have, yes, a teaching obligation, but we also sort of have a pastoral care kind of obligation to try to orient people and to get them excited about research. The other thing also is undergraduate students, generally speaking, are not engaging in primary data collection themselves. They're using other people's data. And so my approach really was around methodological literacy and trying to help people distinguish between good information, bad information, and especially now that we have AI, how they're going to kind of distinguish between all of those kinds of things that they're being bombarded with. And how do they navigate it? And so I chose in the book actually to start with a story. So each chapter starts with what I call a meta example. So it's using real research, not from myself, from a whole host of different examples, from climate change to child protection to terrorism, human security. So these are kind of topics that people would be interested in anyway, and show, okay, this is how researchers in this study talked about these kinds of issues. And then taking from the meta example, like what are the key things that you need to know about this particular method or this particular methodological tool. So the other thing I would also say is, because this is really intended for undergrads, it really goes back to basics, like what is theory? What are disciplines? How do we do a research question? How do we measure things? And so it really is trying to draw from those examples so that people already start to apply, because this is another problem with a lot of methods texts, is that they kind of stop at the level of theory, and people don't really know how to actually use them. So in addition to this meta example, throughout each chapter, and the chapters are also very short because I know that people don't necessarily read. And so the idea is, if you're going to read smartly. So, it's packed with information and also a lot of examples. So there's a lot of activities that are built into each chapter, but also there's a compendium or like a companion kind of teaching guide for people who are instructors who are using this, where I give a lot of other examples and like a question bank and other things. Because the other thing also is that I know, as someone who has been chair and program director, is that often methods courses are not are sometimes the leftover courses that are often given to contract instructors, sometimes like a week or two before the course is starting. And so the idea is actually to give people the tools they need to effectively do a methods course. So the thing that surprised me actually is it's being used at graduate level. So I did not intend it, and even some researchers are also using it. And I think the reason why is because, especially in interdisciplinary programs at a graduate level, you get students who are trained maybe in a particular discipline like political science or economics, but they're not actually trained in how to do interdisciplinary research. And so when I was just after I wrote this book, I was on sabbatical. So I offered, instead of doing a book tour, because you don't really do a book tour with a methods textbook, I offered to do guest lectures. And I did some of those in person, but a lot virtually. And what I was surprised about is the international reach, a bit to Dan's point. Like I didn't expect it to be used in other places. And I didn't expect it to be used at a master's level. It's also used in the master's in refugee studies at the University of London. I think because it's one of the only textbooks that focus explicitly on borders and doing cross-border and cross-cultural kind of research. Yeah, and the other thing I would also say is, so I don't assign it because I don't ever assign my own work, but also because I teach methods mostly in French. But I know that other people are using it. And I also sometimes suggest specific chapters to people I supervise. Again, not as the be all and end all, but as a starting point, and also to show people how different methods or tools are being used in practice, a bit like what Mark and Phil said about their book, because I think this is the challenge with a lot of methods is that it's hard for people to visualize how actually you do the thing without actually doing it yourself. And the only other thing I would say is sometimes in the activities, within the realm of possibility in terms of ethics and things like that, is I suggest activities that actually involve students doing the method. So for example, there's an observation activity where people can go and observe in a public space because you don't need ethics approval to do that. And so again, trying to excite people about research and show that everyone can be a researcher. Like it's not just professors who do research. Everyone is doing research in different ways all the time.
Thank you very much. Before we go on to the third question, I just wanted to come back to the question of supervision. So Phil and Christina, you touched very briefly on how graduate students are citing the research, using it as a permission structure to justify their choice of methods. And Christina, you'd mentioned about recommending a particular chapter to students that you supervise. I'll invite each of you, if you want to, just to very briefly touch on how you've used or you recommend professors might use the textbook in supervising either undergraduate research projects or graduate research projects, and how this supervision might be a bit different from using it in a classroom setting. So if you're supervising a particular project. And Daniel, let's start with you.
I mean, I want to push back maybe a little bit on this. I mean, I think it's very difficult to learn quantitative in just on the side by reading a book. I mean, it's mainly learning by doing. And I think in order I encourage all the students. I mean, for me, methods are kind of, think about building a house. In order to build a house, you need tools. And in order to build a paper, you need methods. Regardless you build different houses, need different methods. But I think for the quantitative part of the survey research, it's very difficult I would step back a little and would say, I encourage my students very heavily. For example, one of the bigger disadvantages in our university is that, for example, the qualitative and the quantitative class at the undergrad level is not mandatory. But I encourage all the students to take both. And I think in my case, if somebody wants to do something on survey research or wants to analyze some data, I would ask him, hey, you take a class or do it. Because, this is very, very difficult to learn on the side, let's say, in an unstructured format, to just say, hey, let's read the book. I mean, it's a learning by doing exercise. You can and redo it, and that's supposed to be. But I think it's still a little bit of challenge. I mean, I think methods are there, especially quantitative methods. I mean, this probably touches on the last questions you want to ask, but for me, I think students can easily understand if they read some theory fourth year. But methods is different. I mean, methods you learn by doing, you learn in a lab, especially quantitative methods. So I think it's much more important for a student to take methods classes than another seminar. They know how to write a paper by then, but they might not have basic understanding of how to do some basic analysis. I think that's a little bit the problem where we are. So I think that the answer, it's very difficult I mean, it's possible and people have done it, but I think methods classes are so important because they are just not so clear cut. But I mean, if I read a theory book, I understand it. But what do most undergrads do when they read quantitative work? They just skip the quantitative part. And I think that's not where we want to be. We want to, if a complete student needs to understand. And I think that's why, for me, that's a push to, and the student is badly prepared if he said, hey, I want to use this survey, want to analyze this, and say, hey, but I've never done any method. So for me, this is a push that we need to really strengthen, or anywhere I mean, the more methods people know, the more the nicer houses they can build, or the more different houses they can build. And I think that's why it's so important. So I moved around your question, but that's my answer.
No, that's exactly what I'm looking for, and I'm hoping we'll spark debates and provoke some good reflections. Christina, would you like to add onto what you had introduced for student supervision?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just pick up on Daniel's point that I think that any methods book is only going to be a starting point. Like, it's not a shortcut to then, you read one chapter and all of a sudden you're going to be an expert in whatever method. And in fact, that's why in each chapter, a bit like Phil and Mark's book, at the end, I have a list of resources, but also throughout, I try to give a lot of very different examples because, you want it to resonate with people. So not everyone's going to be interested in climate change. So maybe then there's an example on some child protection or something else that they're interested in, and it kind of clicks for them. I do think as a supervisor supervising in interdisciplinary, so I'm not really qualified to supervise anyone because I'm an interdisciplinary scholar. So I find that when we have interdisciplinary programs, the danger is that people take a kind of pick and mix approach without actually really understanding the method. So although this book and my approach is interdisciplinary, you still have to master the disciplinary training or the method, a bit to Daniel's point, right? You can't just take one course or read one chapter and be like, okay, all of a sudden I'm an expert on X. I think that there is a humility that comes with being a good interdisciplinary researcher that is sort of like continuous learning. So we're continuously having to learn and apply, and in some cases, adapt the methods because it is interdisciplinary. And that's what I find the book is really a starting point for a conversation. And in some cases, it also helps people, and I'm repeating myself, but go back to the basics, because I think that some people throw around, methodological terms because they've heard them or they've read them, but they actually don't know what they mean. So when you push them on them or say, can you show me how this is manifesting in your project? They're not actually really able to do that. And so I think that textbooks provide people with the basics that they can go back to time and time again. And so it's not just a one-off kind of thing.
Fantastic. Thank you. Phil, would you like to add on to how the book can be used for supervision?
Yeah, I think that there are obviously different levels of supervision in terms of the complexity and in terms of what work you want methods to do. And I think I have found that I use this book for PhD supervision, but not necessarily by handing students the book. I sort of use the categories and insights from the book as a way of framing certain discussions and often longer discussions as part of PhD supervision. And that would include things like, we have a table in the book where we talk about, what is the particular object of this method? What are the concepts? How do you do data collection? What is the data? How do things fit together? And so those are discussions that I find are really useful from this book as a kind of almost as a kind of meta theoretical device for understanding what is it that you want to actually go and find out in this world, and how are you going to frame it. And I think for the PhD level, it's also a question of methods are a political choice to some degree and a theoretical choice, because you are deciding whose voice am I going to listen to and what can I say by listening to that particular voice. And I think there's lots of examples in the different sort of more empirical chapters in our book that do that. For master's level supervision, often, it's a short paper of 12,000 words. You don't have necessarily the space and time as part of that supervision process to do extensive discussions of what method are you going to choose, because often those are students who are not going out to do field work necessarily, but who do need to have a methodological basis for their work. And so I do tend to send chapters of the book to master's students more often. And sometimes, in fact, people who are at the sort of other level of things, in terms of even at the postdoctoral level, people who are not quite in the critical security studies tradition, but who have methods training, who have a PhD in hand, and who just need to get a sense of how to frame their work, what different vocabulary gets used in the field for describing methods that they may already be familiar with from somewhere else. And so there's a broad applicability in that respect. The final thing I'll say is that having served on the research ethics board for a few years, you notice why the ethics board asks for long project descriptions, not just descriptions of the methods, because part of the judgment is this applicant doing something that's proportionate and that fits for what their research design is. And I think, a book like ours and the other three that we're talking about today are useful as well in terms of justifying one's methods to a research ethics board, and also making sure that it's intelligible to people who are, as is the case in the ethics board, people who are outside of one's field and maybe one's entire discipline.
Sounds good. And Mark.
Yeah, I just want to point out something else. Like, I think that at least 50% of the job of the supervisor is not only intellectual, but also kind of emotional and kind of, as Christina was saying, pastoral. And I think that one of the things that I really love about this book is that we've got at least 10 chapters where people talk about challenges or failures, or sort of like pivoting mid-project, or, sort of how they, Anne-Marie Daou has an amazing chapter about the kind of material and emotional limitations of work. She describes how she had kids in the middle of her project, and all of a sudden that radically changed what kind of field work that she could do. And so she had to kind of pivot in between. And Hannah Hughes wrote this amazing piece about how she started off really strong with this idea about what the International Panel on Climate Change did. But the more that she did the research, the more she realized that she was actually incorrect, that her intuition was wrong. And so she had to reconstruct a more compelling one. And I think that hearing those narratives that are in the thick of the research project, that are not like, I had this idea when I was 18, and like I've been shot out of a cannon, and now that I'm 24, I'm going to write a PhD on it, but rather to demonstrate the messiness and the flexibility needed to get through a project. I think that that's really important for the pastoral part of the project. And so I definitely point students who are stuck, who are struggling, or who have a mismatch between their intuition and their data to read some of these chapters, so that they feel like, okay, this is all part of the messy process of completing a project.
And I can imagine that it probably means a little bit more when it's not just the supervisor who's saying it, but it's also other people too.
Totally.
All right. Thank you very much for those thoughts on linking your books to supervision or pushing back and saying that it's better placed within a course. For our last round of questions, I invite you to reflect on the future of research methods teaching. So two broad questions for you to consider here. The first one, what's in the pipeline for you in terms of teaching research methods? So if you can give us a sneak preview on whatever is coming up. And the second question is based on your experience teaching and writing about research methods. What should be the top priorities for research methods teaching in the next 5 years or so? And Daniel, we'll start with you.
Okay, wait, let me just. Okay, so I think what changes, especially for the quantitative teaching, is how to include AI. Because I mean, I mean, I use now, I mean, for example, I give you an example. When I did finish my PhD, it was like 16 years ago now. I thought I'm really good in quantitative methods. I went to summer schools in Essex. I went to Michigan. I took classes at other departments like psychology. So I was mastering the field, and it has been so strongly developing. I mean, more different types of methods. They become more. I mean, now we're the experimental term a little bit in political science. So, for example, there are first textbooks that look at how to do experiments, relatively simple. I think that's also a little bit the future. But also, it has become, I mean, right now, I would say I'm average in methods, in quantity. I mean, my students, some of them know more than I do. Because the training has improved, but also the methods we use have improved. We have opened up to other fields. And now we're opening up again with AI, because AI can be a very important tool that helps us, but it needs to be done correctly. So how, for example, one future textbook is how to use AI correctly when teaching methods, but also when using methods. I think that's a question that's in everybody's mind. But I think that's also where we need to go a little bit with the teaching. We need to show students how to use AI responsibly, or how they trust, because I mean, AI is you can, for example, I use data normally. You had to basically memorize the data commands, or I had like a cheat sheet for a very long cheat sheet. Now, I just get put up in ChatGPT. Okay, how do I run this model? And I basically get the code. So this is cool, but I mean, students still need to know what they do. They still need to know what is the data generating process, but also what does the computer program do. So, and I think that's a little bit the challenge to discuss how to integrate AI, but still that students, I was never a proponent that people, when I did my methods training, it was very theoretical. We had to do it by hand. I did like some kind of recursive models by hand. No clue anymore. So I think that's the past. The future it's more like, okay, how do we understand what these models do, and then how do we use AI to help us in our endeavor, but while still understanding, okay, what do I do? And I think what also helps, we also need to be able to break it down in simple terms. Okay, what did you do? What did the model do? And I think it needs to be broken down in terms that even people that are not necessarily in the field understand. So I think that's kind of the challenges where we are heading. And it's, of course, from a quantitative perspective.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mark, I'll invite you to reflect on the future of research methods teaching.
I'm going to also say AI, but for slightly different reasons than Daniel. For the past 10 years, I've been editor-in-chief of Security Dialogue. And one of the things that we've noticed, even over the past 6 months, if not a year, is an enormous rise in submissions that are AI inflected, like that have the imprint of AI. And so I think that for critical methods and qualitative methods, we've really got to make a strong case why there is no substitute for going out into the field, talking to other humans, doing that in a rigorous way, and then reporting it in a way that is clear. And so I think that because there's such an easy tool that looks like it can produce the same kind of original empirical results that in-person fieldwork does, I think that we're going to really have to be active and make a case that talking to people is still useful, and going to the place and seeing the thing with your own eyes and having those feelings that you have when you get there and when you're in that's a really important part of the process. And I think that that's not just a methods challenge. I think that's a challenge for the university and a challenge for the social sciences in particular.
Phil, what do you envision for the future of research methods teaching?
Well, I found myself nodding along as Mark was talking about this point about fieldwork and justifying going to speak to people. And I think one of the key things coming up is in the era of, declining budgets and the need to produce ever more publications, perhaps in a very instrumental way, we do need to make this argument, right? That like going and engaging with the complexity of society is worth it despite the challenges, because the challenges can be anticipated and can be worked through partly through thinking through questions of methods. And I think the question is, how do we make sure that field work is justified, is useful, and is also non-performative? And this is a phrase I heard from a colleague a few months ago, this idea of performative field work, right? Like I went and spent, a few weeks here and just to say that I did, so that I can get this badge of honor and get my publication out. But I think part of the methodological question is what does that field work do to you and how does it change the project? And I think that more and more, and I think I see this in journals in our field, that there is a certain seriousness about describing one's research design and where one is going with it. And I think part of that, it links to another point I wanted to make about the future of methods, which is keeping up with variations of methods, right? Like we have anticipated a sort of bouquet of things in our book in terms of things like ethnography, but increasingly you have variations, many of which are shaped by the rise in the sort of power and distribution of digital tools. So things like digital ethnography, where some of these same questions do come up about positionality and what your impact is as a researcher on what you're studying. But again, those spaces are qualitatively different than going to the European Commission and doing 5 to 10 interviews, right? A digital ethnography on a social media network or in a large group chat might be very, very different, but it still has these repercussions now that we live more and more of our lives in these kind of online spaces. And then final point, perhaps on the kind of technical digital question that is underlying a lot of where we think things are going. I've seen some fascinating work in our field that is using, large language models to help code applications that can automate elements of data collection as part of discourse analysis, right? So you do have a lot of interesting potential for speeding up some of the elements of the research where it is just a slog of working through, collection of large numbers of legislative acts, for example. So again, you do learn something by sitting through and skimming through them yourself, but sometimes your final purpose is in fact to get faster to the actual meat of the work, which is doing the actual analysis itself. So there are some uses for, what we describe as AI in terms of collecting and processing some of this data. But the challenges are massive. And I say this working with the journal as well in terms of like integrity, and those things are going to have to be much more part of our methodological reflections.
Thank you. And I suspect that we'll be returning to the question of integrity in teaching when we get to the Q&A. Christina, I'll invite you to reflect on the future of research methods teaching.
So I was also going to say AI, but basically everything I was going to say has already been said in many different ways. So I'll park that, although I'm interested in what the attendees maybe think of this as well. The second thing I would also say is adapting methods to the diverse ways of knowing. And I think that especially in the fields that I work on migration studies, sort of development studies, there's been a turn, an ethical turn to thinking about how we produce knowledge, but also how do we co-create knowledge with people who are most affected by the research. And I think we also see this in our student body. We have more first-gen students. We have more students who come from diverse backgrounds, who maybe this is their first experience in their family with university, but also come with different kinds of knowledge and different ways of knowing and doing. So I direct a research project that's a partnership of 13 organizations across Canada, 5 universities, and 9 organizations that work directly with people with lived experience of displacement. So people who come to Canada as refugees or refugee-like situations. And we're trying to widen and deepen access to both education, but also research. And one of the things that has come out of that project is the innovation that comes when we work across sectors. So we have university partners, we have the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, we also have Amnesty International that has a long history of doing research, but research in a very different context. We have a health provider, Access Alliance. So thinking not only interdisciplinarity, but also across different sectors and how they think about research and knowledge and how that knowledge is used differently in those different spaces, I think is a really interesting kind of question and a future of how we teach, but also how we learn. So thinking more about experiential education within the methods courses. So I've always tried to integrate some kind of community partnership in all of my methods courses, again, to try to communicate to students that research happens outside of universities. It's not a solely kind of academic project. But second of also to show them that what they do matters, right? Like to so that it's not just some kind of academic assignment they're doing, but it's something that can be useful to people, even if it is something as simple as a literature review, because, our partners in the community don't necessarily have access to all the scholarly literature, but second of all, don't have the time to read it and synthesize it. And the third thing I would also say, which again, I am only imperfectly doing, is I think Christine, you opened this session with an Indigenous affirmation. And I think as at least Canadian researchers, but I would say also in many other parts of the world, especially in contexts of settler states like Australia and others, that we have a responsibility, not only because it's in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but also as researchers interested in equity and methods, to really take seriously Indigenous ways of knowing and doing. And I think that many mainstream textbooks do not do this well. And I also think that many of us who are settlers, who don't have Indigenous backgrounds, are I think there's a fine line. We don't want to appropriate methods or use them inappropriately, but I also think there's not enough acknowledgement that these are legitimate ways of doing things. And again, I think that when we have a duty in our methods courses to invite Indigenous elders and other knowledge keepers so that knowledge is conveyed to students, but also it, again, is, I don't like this word, but like legitimized and legible, I think is what Phil said earlier. So I think that's another future of methods. And I don't see a lot of obviously there are some very important reference points. There's a lot of good work that's being done, but I feel like, again, it doesn't necessarily get into some of these textbooks the way that it should.
So many points for us to jump off of. And Christina, what you mentioned at the end just made me think of an activity that I did in one of my research methods classes where the students were tasked with conducting a research project to figure out what should be parts of the content of our department's Indigenous Action Plan. One of the student groups actually did a key informant interview with the faculty's Indigenous curriculum specialist. And we had some long conversations about how she was going to build in an Indigenous affirmation as part of the key informant interview. And so she was a settler. She is a settler, but was very engaged on, so how do I bring some of these ideas about the content and the ways of co-constructing the knowledge into the research method itself. So it's definitely something that our students are asking for. And so it's an invitation for our textbook authors to think about that and to bring it into their future work. So at this point, I'd like to open up the floor, and I'll take a look at the question and answer box. And so I'll just invite the audience. If you have a question, you can write it into the question and answer box. That's what I'm looking at. There. Okay. So I see, okay, a question from Remy. So all of these books seem like excellent resources to draw on. Thank you for sharing some of the professional circumstances and scholarly convictions that motivated your work. Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with the book content, but my question relates to pedagogy on the actual teaching of methods. Is the intended audience both student and instructor? Are there any sections that have the instructor in mind as the primary audience? Are there sections that disclose the challenges of teaching methods for both students and instructors? To further complicate my question, when discussing and reflecting on the learning experiences of students, what are the ethical questions that educators need to keep in mind? So, broad question, what are some of the ethical questions that you need to keep in mind as a research methods instructor? Are there particular parts of your book that have the instructor in mind as the primary audience? And do your books have any information that talk about the challenges of teaching research methods? So, because you haven't had a chance to prepare, I'll give you 30 seconds to think about that, and I'll start by calling on Phil. So whenever you're ready, you can unmute.
I haven't used my 30 seconds, but let me give it a try. I think well, in our book we don't, as far as I remember, have an explicit discussion of teaching. But we do intend it to be a teaching tool. And so when I think about, I had a conversation with a colleague just last week about, using the book in teaching, but it was not anywhere on this colleague's syllabus, right? Like this person was designing a course that worked for what they were trying to do, and used our book quite extensively in trying to sort of frame the course and frame the discussions of methods, but didn't actually assign the text itself. So sometimes there's some elements in terms of how it gets used in teaching that are not captured by the statistics or by any sort of paper trail. But certainly, we're sort of pleased to see that so many people do use it in that way. The other way is that, we've heard from colleagues that use the book to teach and that find themselves being inspired by the text and taking extensive notes on the text, right? And so at some point, there is a sort of downstream impact on those instructors thinking about their own research, but again, in ways that are very likely not able to be captured in any statistics or in anything other than a kind of personal feedback or testimonial type thing. On the question of ethics, I think that's a tough one. And I think, I mean, we had talked a little bit about integrity before. But I think in terms of the learning experiences of students, I think one of the things is that we have to, as instructors, we have a duty to care for where we're sending students who are learning to do research, and who we send them to speak to. Because again, qualitative field work, for example, is an intervention into society, and we want to make sure that people who are learning about methods make those interventions in ways that are ethically appropriate, and not just as defined by the Research Ethics Board, but also as defined in terms of, what we think is a sort of prevailing sense of our responsibility, including, for example, to indigenous communities. That's my first run take on that, but I'm thankful for the invitation to think a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark, would you...
Thanks. I think that as we said, we started this project in an effort to provide validation resources for folks within a kind of critical part of the field. So I think that we are kind of pedagogical intent was not to consolidate a field and to concretize like a single description of the method, but rather to pluralize. And so that leads us in pedagogy to be pretty ecumenical, like that we are really providing a bunch of tools. Like I don't agree with all of the methods that are in our own book, like there are some that I don't think are the right fit for some projects. And so I think being really honest and clear about those strategic choices is kind of where I feel the ethical imperative to come from. I'm not expressing it very well. I think that as scholars and supervisors, one of our primary ethical drives is not to impose our idea of what methods is, but rather to empower students to come up, like to develop their own proper sense of ethics, their own proper sense of their own vision, and how to articulate their own sense in the best way possible, in a way that meets a test of rigor, and in a way that is comprehensible to the other humans. And so, I think that I understand our kind of ethical relationship in pedagogy to be one of facilitation rather than one of kind of authoritativeness. And so that, to me, is how I try to balance that. Thanks.
Thank you. And Daniel, I'll invite you to weigh in.
I might just add something quickly. I think when you teach methods, it's also important that you're authentic to yourself. I think it's always interesting if you bring your own research, your own current research, and say, hey, here's I applied this. I mean, for me, here I did a regression, or here's a paper I kind of wrote, and here's what I did. Because I think that also captures students and say, wow, this is pretty cool. This is pretty interesting. So I think these textbooks we have, they are like background tools. I don't think they serve all purposes. I think they should be used like as some background reading. But I think what's very important for really, because capturing students' attention is to bring in your own research, to bring in your own, and what you're doing right now, your own analysis. So it becomes also more concrete and also I think that's the last thing in terms of pedagogy. Methods can only be learned, and I think any type of methods by doing them. So if we talk about pedagogy, a class that only is theoretical in methods, it's a no-go. I mean, I think if it's a quantitative or qualitative task, they need to, in simple way, they need to do it. You cannot learn how to build a house by watching a video. You need to actually do it. And the same way, you cannot learn methods by not doing them. So I think all methods we talk about pedagogy need to be the most practical possible. I leave it as such.
That's music to my ears, and I agree entirely that methods need to be practiced. And Christina, I'll invite you to add your thoughts.
Yeah, so for the first question, I mean the book is really primarily intended, the primary audience is students, but I'm hoping that it's a tool that can be used by instructors. As I mentioned, there's, a lot of activities and things like that. And also the publisher, if you purchase it as an instructor, gives you this sort of instructor pack that has, lecture notes, all of this kind of stuff. But I agree with Daniel that, this has to be supplemented. It's not intended to be a standalone piece. It has to be made meaningful in context. And the other thing is because this book is intended for so many different kinds of programs, you have to tailor it to the program, whether it be human rights or conflict studies or migration or whatever. So, I think that there's still some work that needs to be done by the instructor to kind of make it meaningful. And I think that leads to the second question. I agree with everything that's been said. I don't think our role as instructors is to tell people the one and only way to do methods. I think it's about trying to expose people to a range of different options and tools that are going to be helpful for them depending on their context. One thing I would say that is a sort of adjacent comment is that for me, ethics runs throughout the book. I think one of the problems with a lot of methods textbooks is either they omit ethics altogether because they assume the REB is going to take care of that, as Phil says. But I also think that if you do have an ethics section, it's often just one chapter. I have the chapter very early on, and then I refer back to those ethical questions throughout because every methodological choice is an ethical choice. And I think that students really need to acknowledge that. And the other thing I would say about ethics is I think that so I've been teaching for about 20 years now, and I think that I don't know if it's just uh, a general fatigue or a reading of the room, but it feels to me that students are becoming more and more stressed. There's more and more external pressures on them, whether it be financial, whether it be because their home countries are being bombed, whether it be racial injustice. There's so many different things that they're struggling with. And I think that that's, some of my colleagues are like, oh, we're not here to be counselors. I understand that. But I think inevitably in our classes, we have to adapt our pedagogy to meet people where they're at, both in terms of if we make things too complicated for people, they are going to resort to AI. I think that it's natural. If they feel overwhelmed with an assignment, their first reaction is going to go to AI to try to find an answer. So I think we have to preempt that by breaking it down and saying, these are the ways in which we can use the tools. And so, I think that's an ethical approach to teaching methods. And I also think it's about allowing space in our classrooms for those difficult conversations because and showing how methodology, because I mean this is one of the things that I do from the very beginning is I show one research project or one research question and I show three examples of published research that comes up with totally different answers to the question. And so this actually opens up the conversation to people to say we might have very, severe differences about the way we approach something, but it doesn't, you can still find a common ground in trying to understand the way that people got to that answer. And so again, I think it's about equipping people to have these very difficult conversations in an increasing polarized society where students are being, through algorithms and others, introduced into very, specific ways of thinking about things. And I think our role is to try to complicate that a little bit and show, in fact, there are many different ways of seeing this. And in fact, there are many different ways to do research that comes up with different answers to the same question.
That is a beautiful way to end our conversation this morning, this afternoon, this evening, depending on which part of the world you're joining us from. So I want to say a huge thank you to Doctors Christina Clark-Kazik, Mark Salter, Phil Froud, and Daniel Stockamer for these insights that you shared with us, for taking us behind the covers of your textbooks. A note to the audience, if you found today's session valuable, then don't let the momentum stop. Let's keep the conversation going. So I'll invite you to log into the MethodsNet portal, and you can join the Research Methods Teaching Community of Practice. There are 5 other communities that you can join. For today's, you can share your key takeaways from the webinar. If you want to talk more about the pluralism that gets infused into our research methods courses, if you've got more questions or thoughts about ethics and AI, about the changing student body, student experiences, the ways that you can deliver your courses. You can also follow us on social media to stay updated on our latest resources. And thank you to our speakers, thank you to our attendees for your commitment to methodological rigor. We look forward to seeing your proposals for the fall conference and to welcoming you to our summer school. And as Dan mentioned, it's an important part of research training. And I believe you mentioned that you had attended 4 or 5 summer schools. So you can get started with the research methods summer schools by MethodsNet. So have a wonderful and productive day of research and teaching, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.